مفكرة ومنظرة سياسية من الطراز الرفيع.
Think about it now as a democratic trap. This sort of weird fake neutrality or purity in this context. There's not a technological fix for the political problems caused by capitalism. Big companies are predatory. They buy little companies and tear them up and eat them up, not to be more efficient, but just to destroy them. Employment problems and harassment because of people reading it only for like one line. On the decisive political issues of our time, there's no middle ground.
مفكرة ومنظرة سياسية من الطراز الرفيع، وأستاذة العلوم السياسية في كليات هابرد وويليام سميث في نيويورك. بتشوف أنه ما ينقصنا في عالمنا السياسي ونضالاتنا السياسية اليوم هو السياسة نفسها. أما السياسة يلي منشارك فيها بحياتنا اليومية فهي مجرد سلعة للاستهلاك. سابقاً السلعة كانت تقاس على مقاس المجموعات، اليوم السلعة تقاس على مقاس الفرد الواحد، وهيك السياسة كمان. وهذا الأمر بيعني أنه كل خياراتنا كمستهلكين بتتحول اليوم إلى سياسة. فنوعية الأغذية يلي بنستهلكها بتتحول إلى موقف سياسي من الغذاء. علاقتنا الخاصة مع المرأة أو نظرتنا إلى الجندر بتتحول إلى موقف سياسي من المرأة أو من الجندر. مصالحنا المباشرة يلي بتتعلق بقضية معينة بتتحول إلى موقف من هذه القضية، وبتصير السياسة ليست سوى استجابة مباشرة لحاجاتنا الفردية، ومن ثم تتحول هي السياسة إلى رأي يجب مشاركته على الإنترنت. كل شخص بيبدي رأيه السياسي على مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي، وبيعتقد أنه إبداء الرأي هاد مهم جدا، وهو فعل تواصلي ونضالي وإيجابي جدا. لكن بتشوف دين أنه هذا الفعل التواصلي نفسه سلبي جدا، لأنه فعل النشر في حد ذاته هو يلي بيمنع حدوث فعل على أرض الواقع. فمثلا بيمنع النشر أنه الموضوع المناقش يتحول إلى نقاش موضوعي ومنتج، إلى حراك، إلى تنظيم سياسي، إلى عمل ملموس. وكأنه كل ما زادت الناشطية على الإنترنت قلت الفاعلية على أرض الواقع. وهذا الأمر هو يلي أطلقت عليه جودي دين اسم الرأسمالية التواصلية، وكتبت عنه كتير. دين إلها كتابات ونظريات وأفكار كتيرة تستحق القراءة والتفكير، والحلقة طبعاً لا تكفي لمناقشة كل أفكارها. وبعيداً عن نظرياتها وأفكارها، كتبت جودي دين مقالة ونشرتها على موقع فيرسو بعد أحداث غزة في 7 أكتوبر 2023 بعنوان فلسطين تتحدث باسم الجميع. مقالة أعدت أنها إشكالية، وأدت هالمقالة إلى إعفائها من منصبها التدريسي وأحالتها للتحقيق بحجة أن هذه المقالة تعرض طلاب الكلية للخطر. رجعت مؤخرا دين للتدريس في الكلية بعد ما وصل التحقيق لنتيجة أنه تصريحاتها لم تعرض أي من طلاب الكلية للخطر. لذلك تواصلت مع بروفيسور دين ودعيتها إلى إجراء حوار على هذا البودكاست لحتى أسألها عن هالمقالة وعن آرائها وأفكارها المختلفة. وطبعا أنا ممتنة جدا لتلبيتها الدعوة وتجاوبها السريع جدا معي. رح أنتقل إلى الحوار معها مباشرة، لكن قبل ما أنتقل بحب أتشكركم من قلبي على كل الدعم يلي وصلني منكم بالحلقة الأولى يلي نشرتها. وبحب ذكر المتابعين أنه المنصة هي منصة مستقلة، لذلك كل أشكال الدعم، لايك وشير وتعليق سلبي وإيجابي بيساعد باستمرار المنصة، فشكرا على الدعم. Professor Dean, in your book Democracy and Other Neoliberal Fantasies, you seem to argue, if I understood you correctly, against a particular understanding of democracy. You suggest that democracy is without content and that the political confrontation today is not between democracy and fascism or between democracy and non-democracy, but rather there is a problem within democracy itself. Could you please elaborate on your views on democracy?
Sure. So I want to first start with a little bit of contextualizing of the book, Democracy and Other Neoliberal Fantasies. I wrote it, I guess it was fairly early in the George W. Bush administration and the Iraq War. And Bush was arguing, and his administration was arguing, that this war and this war on terror was democratic and a war for democracy. And people may recall that I guess it was February 2003, there were some of the largest demonstrations the world had ever seen, and like millions in the streets, all on the same day to protest what was clearly going to be the US invasion of Iraq, because we were already in Afghanistan in response to the 9/11 attacks. And Bush still said, like, well, yes, the people have spoken. We've had a good discussion and we're still going to bomb. And so it was very present, this rhetoric of democracy being openly used to further US militarism and imperialism. And at the same time of this, I mean, this was not this, it didn't take any kind of fancy interpretation to see this. This was just like everyday knowledge. But at the same time, political theorists, academics, opinion, influences or whatever we call them in the mainstream media, everyone was speaking as if democracy was the horizon of all politics. Like, we just have to be more democratic. And so you have this inability for democracy to be a term of critique, because democracy was the term justifying imperialist aggression. And it was deeply, deeply frustrating for any kind of critical-minded thinker or political person to try to point this out. It's just like immediately becomes like, what's your definition of democracy? Are you anti-democracy? Like there was this I would think about it now as a democratic trap. The only possible way of thinking about politics was democracy. And so my work at that time was reacting to this and was trying to point out the limits of democracy as a horizon or a term for critique, particularly for left critique, because of the ways that U.S. imperialism was using democracy as its justification for aggression.
Well, okay, you mentioned that you wrote this years ago, but don't you think that it still applies today, especially since most political democracies are leaning sharply to the right?
Yeah. What's interesting right now is we have a number of state societies that are openly illiberal democracies. I'm thinking of Brazil during the Bolsonaro time and still with the strong Bolsonaro tendencies. I'm thinking of the UK during Brexit, and of course, Hungary, Poland, the United States. And what's interesting here is that the language of and of course Israel, is that we can have this language of illiberal democracy, but democracy is not really telling us anything, right? Democracy is not a signifier that's saying anything about the politics there. It's the sort of illiberal part that actually gives us some new content, namely virulent forms of nationalism and a far right nationalism in all of these contexts. And so now, like, going back to like, why is this important today, or how do we see this today? With the U.S. presidential election, which is just god awful, but the language is each side is saying they're defending democracy, right? Each side says that democracy is at stake. Each side says that the other is completely bringing down the entire U.S. republic. I mean, so the right uses the same thing against the left uses it against the right. democracy is not telling us anything. It's back, particularly in the 90s, early 2000s, people in political theory loved the language of the empty signifier. This was really powerful. I actually don't even think it's an empty signifier now. It's just like filler. It's like stupid talk. An empty signifier means that you can possibly fill it in to create a kind of set of hegemonic, a new hegemony, a set of alliances that will fight for something. And this will be the term under which they'll fight. But democracy has been so misused, corrupted, turned it, I don't know, like, what would we call it? Like if we've got fake news, like fake signifiers or fake political ideals, it's just utterly lost a capacity to carry political ideals. I recognize that in a number of struggles, saving democracy becomes the term that saving democracy is everybody's goal. But like, I just got back from Caracas. I mean, which side is saving democracy? Both sides say they are, and the international community on both sides come in and say they're saving democracy. And what I see, the side that I think is the meaningful, the purposeful, the side is the anti-imperialist side, right? All of the different, like the majority of countries that have come in recognizing the official results of the election have been from Africa. They've been some of the countries of South America, and then China, Russia, Iran, Cuba. They've not been the United States and Europe. So to say democracy, again, isn't going to help us. Actually, what we see these days is much more a set of sides. And I think these are sides against imperialism.
Well, may I ask you here, coming from the Middle East, specifically Syria, it is easy to notice that the term anti-imperialism is frequently used in mainstream media and often misused in political discourse, especially by authoritarian regimes. Why shouldn't we view this term with the same skepticism? While it may not be as much of an empty signifier as democracy, it still seems to lose meaning when used in this way. How can we differentiate between the two?
I think that's a good question. A lot of it depends on how we fight for the terms and how we fight for the language of, let's say, the language of liberation and who takes it up. And so it's not like, it's not like something that, one person decides or you and I theorize and come up with like, oh, here, it's great, right? I think it comes from the movements and comes from the discourse that we then can see, is it coming out? So generally speaking, I think about our kind of present, as let's say the last 30 or 40 years, with a concept from Slavoj Žižek, the decline of symbolic efficiency. I think it's really, really useful. And what that concept refers to is the way that symbols or signifiers have lost their ability to transmit the same meaning across different contexts. So democracy is a great example of this because it doesn't really transmit meaning anymore. All it does is say, I think I'm a good guy. But that could be anything. So this decline of symbolic efficiency is generally, you can apply this to lots and lots of different things, but probably not everything all the time. I mean, we can still have conversations with people, right? You can still, order food at a restaurant or pay a bill, right? It's not like there's an utter collapse of meaning into complete and total babble. But it is the case that meaning is carried more, say, tribally, sectorally, among those who are already like camps or allies or groups, and that cross camp or, from one tribe to another, the same terms aren't going to be used the same way. And they're going to actually, if you think that you're speaking the same language as your adversary, that's a little bit of naivete, because you will get deeply, deeply attacked and criticized for it when you think you're saying something that's utterly factual. And it's just like, oh, no, our signifying world is completely different from that. Let me see if I'll just use a personal example on this. So I wrote a piece for the Verso blog called Palestine Speaks for Everyone. And the opening of that piece talks about the feeling of exhilaration that many had when they saw the images of the paragliders, going through against all possible odds. I'm continued to be like, just this morning, there was a long editorial in my local paper. It was completely disturbing, saying that I'm a champion of rape and violence against women. And this is, I've been allowed to return to the classroom. My case is over, but it's a very long, just virulent editorial about no student and no Jewish or Israeli person is safe in my classroom because I celebrate rape and violence against women. And I'm a feminist scholar. And so this is deeply distressing. So the same language that is a language that millions around the world recognize to be true, which is that to see an oppressed people rise up is an inspiring and amazing thing, and it creates a sense of hope in the world, that is being read as saying that, oh no, you celebrate violence and rape, particularly, you are celebrating rape. Right? I still find this, I'm tempted to just say they're morons, but I don't think that's true. I think it's something different, but it's this wildly divided, divisive, changed world where there's not a communication that goes across these chasms. That sort of went off the rails on my answer, but.
Well, all solidarity to you with what you're facing. I'll come back to this topic shortly, but before that, I'd like to continue with another question about your book. In the book, you discuss how people today share their thoughts and feelings on the internet as a form of political participation, sometimes viewing it as a type of struggle and communicative action. However, you describe this as passive or interpassive, using Zizek's and Fowler's term. Could you elaborate on this idea and explain how it relates to your notion of communicative capitalism?
Okay, so again, I'm going to contextualize this some. That work was also, in addition to kind of coming out of the Bush administration, post 9/11 setting, it was also coming out of the a lot of interactions I'd had over the previous, 8 years regarding the enthusiasm around digital media, tactical media, hacktivism, new media, participatory democracy. And the idea was that, everything is going to be super democratic. This is a new people's form of government. And there was like a lot of net hype, a lot of hype about the internet as this really wonderful invention of democracy. And I was very critical early on when a lot of people were not, when a lot of people thought that this was really going to be a new form of democracy. And my basic take was like, there's not a technological fix for the political problems caused by capitalism. Right, that in the broader setting, the issues have to do with capitalism, with markets, with dramatic inequality, and then this is where my communicative capitalism comes in, with the way that networked media subjects communication to market logics. So people stop communicating in order to have a real understanding with one another. You communicate in order to get likes and shares and go viral. And that can happen whether or not one says something that's true or whether or not that says something that's utterly false or a lie. And actually, lots of times things that are just gross lies circulate much more rapidly. They get a lot more attention than sort of more nuanced and true statements, because outrage, cuteness, sex, all of the things that give us a quick dopamine rush, these circulate rapidly. And that's really terrible for communication oriented towards reaching understanding. But it's great for communication as a generator of information, as a resource to be scraped and mined and put to other forms of use by giant tech capitalist firms.
Speaking of capitalism, unlike many thinkers on the left, you don't believe it is dying. Instead, you argue that it is transitioning its modes and evolving into a new form, which is neo-feudalism. How do you define neo-feudalism?
Yeah, that's so funny. That's what my editor, who has the whole manuscript, keeps asking me. She's like, wait a minute, how are you defining neo-feudalism? Basically I don't really define it. I shape it and try to see it as a tendency where capitalism follows non-capitalist dynamics. So neo-feudal dynamics would be those that involve hoarding, predation or predatory behavior, hoarding, and destruction, instead of capitalist dynamics. So capitalist laws of motion are things like improvement is necessary in order to expand and make profits. So there's an idea that there has to be improvement, reinvestment, and expansion. And so and this is an important way of thinking about capitalism, because it's not just about something like private property and ownership and workers selling their labor power. It recognizes the dynamics that private property and workers selling their labor power, the dynamics that generates. So the idea of neo-feudalism is that private property and workers selling their labor power is generating different dynamics, ones that are not the typical capitalist ones, so that now, in order to accumulate, there's not reinvestment. The big companies, they eat their proceeds. They have stock buybacks, right? There's not improvement. Instead, big companies are predatory. They buy little companies and tear them up and eat them up, not to be more efficient, but just to destroy them, right? To get them out of the competitive field. So, and then you've got like more and more hoarding, particularly land hoarding, where someone like Bill Gates is one of the top landholders in the United States. He's not a farmer. So these dynamics, and remember that, what was it? The Panama Papers, was that what it was called? It was all of this, it was this revelation of the trillions of dollars in assets being held in offshore accounts by the global sort of asset holding elite a few years ago. So the idea is that because of the challenges of capital accumulation in the present, right? The good old Marxist declining rate of profit. And I can go into all the gory details, but I won't. But because of these challenges, what you have is and I get this term from Robert Brenner, the politically driven upward redistribution of wealth. So it's not about investment. It's not about production. It's about hoarding and destruction. And those are feudal dynamics, not capitalist dynamics.
Thank you for your answer. I know it was a big question and difficult to delve into details. Now I'd like to turn to another one of your books, Crowds and Party, and ask you about it. In the introduction, you state, and I have the introduction here, so I will quote, "The function of the party is holding open a gap in our setting so as to enable a collective desire for collectivity. The crowd's breach of the predictable and given creates the possibility that a political subject might appear." End of quote. I have two questions regarding this paragraph. The first one is, how do you define or describe this gap, and what is it exactly?
So to get to the gap, let's start with the normal and the everyday and the expected. I think everybody knows that parties and social movement actors just work ceaselessly to get people to come to stuff. And, it's like you do it with social media, you do it with your friends, you do it with, placards and announcements. And then there can be a good march and everybody's excited and you put the photos up and make some speeches and then do the same thing the next week. And this is kind of like one of the ways that mass mobilized politics, particularly on the left, but not exclusively, that's one of the ways it looks. Sometimes something changes. And sometimes there is like more people come out, or the people won't leave, right? They don't go home. Like Occupy Wall Street was wild because what made it go off was that people didn't go home at the end. They stayed, and then more people came to stay. Or I loved the Gezi Park protests because there was a sign with something like, I don't remember the exact, I mean, I don't speak Turkish, but it went something like, on the first day we were criminals, on the second day we were thugs, on the third day we were the people. And so they began to appear differently in the media, to publics, to themselves, as carriers of something else. I think right now in the protest in Kenya are at this pivot point, this juncture point, where they're becoming more than just an anti-tax movement, but actually a real youth-led revolutionary movement. So there's a point then where the everyday politics of demonstration and resistance becomes something more, and no party can make that happen. We create the conditions for that to happen, but it will come from the people. Right, like we as in party, the party can know it will happen at some point. It might be next month, it might be next year. It will happen at some point, but we can never predict exactly when and exactly what will make it go. So that comes from the people within this setting, and then, but all movements ebb and flow. And so the next role of the party then is to keep alive and further all of the hope and the energy and aspirations during the times of the ebb, so that when people come back out, they will realize, they will go further again, not have to like start back at the very beginning. So I think that this is the crucial role of the party. It's a location of memory. It's a location of the memory of the class, right? Or the memory of the working people, to say like, oh, we've already known that we know how to do this, and a set of reminders, and it furthers that, it holds on to and furthers that knowledge.
Okay, here comes my second question. In your recent essay on Verso, Palestine Speaks for Everyone, you present a related idea. You write, and I have the essay here, so I'll read from it. When we witness such actions, many of us also feel this sense of openness. Our response is indicative of the subject effect the actions unleash. Something in the world has changed because the subject has inscribed a gap in the given. Hamas wasn't the subject of the October 7 action. It was an agent hoping that the subject would emerge as an effect of its action. The last instantiation of the Palestinian revolution. End of quote. Now, I know you've spoken and explained your views on this a lot recently, but I felt that you're saying something different here, and that this part isn't clear and is misunderstood. Could you please clarify what you mean by this?
First, I am so glad you asked about this and that you said this, because to me, that is what I was writing about, the conditions of possibility of the emergence of the subject. And the whole thing is this theoretical piece about the subject. And yet, I've got these sort of employment problems and harassment because of people reading it only for like one line, which is actually related to what I was saying earlier about things don't translate beyond your sort of discursive community. So first of all, we've seen in multiple years, what are there, like 2014, 2018, 2021, we've seen instances of attempts of Palestinians to fight back and Israeli aggression. And typically, I mean, and additional Israeli aggression. I don't want it to sound at all like Israel's not, as an occupier, there's a level of all constant aggression. But I mean, these sort of moments of actual, huge invasions and sort of and attacks and military stuff. So, but we have these moments, and the many in the global community respond and show outrage, and there might be some demonstrations, but they dissipate fairly quickly, and they haven't changed, or they didn't change any sort of global equations. It's more like, this is what happens in, like, from an American perspective, it'd just be like, oh, the Middle East is always messed up, and kind of dismissed. And it's like, oh, this is normal. It's bad, but it's normal. That's what they do. And I think that gets also wrapped up in a kind of Israeli invincibility because of the Iron Dome defense system. And then the problems, so stop there. So what happens then in October of 2023 breaks through this, and it breaks through with a visible attack's not quite a visible act of liberation that was not predictable, right? It was not, we say an oppressed people will rise up, but if you're not seeing it, it can sometimes just be a hope and a sense of something in the history. But then to see this kind of breaking through was something much broader, much bigger. And there was a global response to this, a global seeing of this as more. It's like there's a kind of disbelief and a hope that was wrapped up in disbelief. Now that effect then, so the effect lets us see that, oh my God, it's a subject that has made this. And the subject is the Palestinian revolution. It's not just any one group or any one set of groups. It's not any one group of people. It's, in fact, the Palestinian revolution itself coming through as a subject saying, we are here, we will be free. And I think part of the what's also been going on for the last now 303 days, 304 days, is that subject remains present, and the entire constellation globally has changed in terms of what the political calculations are, who is present, and what can be seen. And then. One of the big questions is, how long will the subject be visible? When will, attention change? When will people go back? When will exhaustion set in? When will catastrophe make the human rights and humanitarian discourse take over from the presence of a political subject marking itself in history? And those answers, you can't predict exactly. I'm not sure if that answered exactly what you're looking for.
Your answer perfectly addresses my question. Now, allow me to ask you something that's been on everyone's mind lately. Is it worth it? Is this event worth the destruction, death, displacement, and invasion we've seen over the past 10 months? And given all that's happened, if you had the chance to write this piece again, would you still write the same thing, or would you change anything?
I would write the same thing. I think that a subject, part of the gap of the subject is it changes, existing modes of valuation, and it changes what we can think of as possible and worthwhile. And that's part of the thing that makes it, scary and frustrating and new, is because it changes those things. I think we've got to look at it from a kind of world historical perspective. And so 1 year later is not enough, but what about 3 years later or 15 years later? That's, and I also don't think it's primarily, no, I'm not going to say it. I was about to say, I don't think it's primarily a question that I should answer, was it worth it? Like, there's something gross about it. But then on the other hand, no, I think any person in the world should be able to say, was this, was a liberation struggle? Was it worth it? And to be part of a discussion about that, though ultimately it's the people who are liberating themselves who answer that question.
There's another part of your essay that I'd like to ask you about. You've mentioned that causes being individualized based on one's needs, fears, and desires and concerns. Could you please explain what you mean by that?
No, yeah. Why don't we talk about this with respect to the student movement in the U.S. What was so exciting about the movement that exploded on U.S. and then it went beyond the U.S. But exploded on U.S. college campuses in April of 2024, April of this year, is that American students have in general been utterly fractured by identity politics and by a kind of therapy culture and a kind of culture that says what's most important is what you as an individual want, and you need to just take care of yourself as an individual and find your specific this and your specific that, and all this just like unbelievably individualizing. And these encampments, these solidarity encampments, said no to that hegemonic message of the therapeutic imperialist university that was trying to keep people divided and make people sort of belly button navel gazers, preoccupied with their own life. These students refused that and said, no, we see a genocide and we have to do everything we can to stop that. And they built from the larger BDS movement, which has done work on college campuses for over a decade. So that helped strengthen them. But what they really refused was the individualism and self-centeredness and narcissism and therapeutic culture of the universities, to say we will choose meaning in our lives, and that meaning comes from stopping a genocide. Even if, like, we will take that, we will get expelled, we will get suspended, we will maybe face lawsuits. Some people are being investigated for material support for terrorism charges. We will put our bodies on the line and get beaten up by Zionist thugs and by cops, because we have to be the people who can answer the question, what did you do in a genocide? And it's like, we tried to get our universities to stop supporting it. We tried to raise attention to it. And then with that commitment, they also created environments that worked across all of the differences that 20 years of identity politics had tried to use to separate them. So by race, by religion, by ethnicity, by gender, everybody's working together on these. And so it was, I hope that we will see the same, that there will be continued learning from that point from April in the fall. I think there will be, but it was a really quite amazing negation of refusal of the dominant attitude of the sort of therapeutic imperialist university.
You just answered my next question. I was about to ask you for your thoughts on the pro-Palestine students' protest in the US and Europe. However, some people think these protests lack a clear goal. For example, I recently spoke with Slavoj Žižek and asked him the same question, and he said he believes the protests are ineffective and lack a plan. What do you think of his assessment, and do you agree with him?
No, I think that's completely reductive and irritating. Makes me mad. Like I like Slavoj Žižek. I'm influenced by his work. We're friendly, but this is a ridiculous take. And the first of all is it ignores the effect of it ignores the effect of political action back on the subjects themselves, right? Back on the students themselves. They learn how to do new things. Right, that takes them further. Participating in these actions changes them as human beings and creates new political possibilities in the future. That's one thing. Second thing, the majority of them had boycott, divestment, and sanction goals. They actually had real plans. So I don't know where Slavoj is coming from in saying they didn't. I mean, I talked with numerous students during this summer, and they've been working during the summer on plans, thinking about how some of them are still in contact with their board of trustees. When they're not, they're making plans for what they're going to do in the fall. So this business about they don't have any plans, I just think that's just ignorance.
Some people struggle to define their political positions clearly. While supporting the Palestinians and opposing the violence and destruction caused by the Netanyahu government is clear, the specifics are complicated by the influence of political Islam, oppressive regimes, and Western media's focus on Hamas. Here I'd like to ask you why you don't support the approach of rejecting both Hamas and Israel, as some do. Many people today choose to remain neutral, neither supporting Hamas nor Israel, sometimes out of fear and sometimes due to the complexity of the situation. How do you interpret this perspective?
I think it's cowardice and naivete. There's no on the decisive political issues of our time, there's no middle ground. The ground of peace in the context of an Israeli genocide means that you have to be against Israel and in favor of the forces opposing Israel. There's not a neutral position there. Right? So that's the first thing. And then you have to say, okay, well, what is the major force that's opposing Israel? Well, it's been the coalition put together around Hamas. Now, one may not like Hamas for whatever one's reasons are, but that's who's leading that. And so to not defend them is to be on the side of Israel. So I don't think there's a middle ground. Like, you can't be a UN aid worker without getting killed by Israel. You can't be a visiting doctor without being killed by Israel. You can't, there's not a place now for a kind of humanitarian neutrality do-gooder position, right? You can't even be in favor of international law without being against Israel. So the situation, I think, could have been understood in more complex terms maybe a year ago or 2 years ago. We would have to sort of look at that in detail. And then one could, recognize, there has been a lot of frustration in Gaza with Hamas, the ongoing conflicts between Hamas and Fatah. That's always an issue. But, in the context of a genocide, this changes. And I think there's a great deal of, I actually don't really understand how people want to hold on to their own kind of like this sort of weird fake neutrality or purity in this context. This is not like, one could be, I guess, neutral in the United States between Democrats and Republicans and say they both, are both bad. But that's not what this is in, with respect to this ongoing genocide that Israel and the United States are carrying out.
I'd like to end our discussion with the question about the left. The left in the Arab region has a history of aligning with authoritarian regimes, which has negatively impacted its reputation. Adding to this, of course, are the global failures and frustrations associated with communism, along with the left melancholy described by Walter Benjamin. Given these factors, how do you view the current state of the left? And in other words, using Zizek's words, how can the left dare to speak its name today? How can the left still find the courage to assert its identity today?
I think that we need to recognize that the failure is a failure of liberalism. And that the reason that liberalism has failed is because it has always and only been a legitimation structure for the capital accumulation of the bourgeoisie or of the capitalist class, and that it is important to hold on to the ideals that they use to present themselves and to use them against them. But that doesn't make the liberal capitalist our ally, particularly now, right? After 30 or 40 years of global neoliberalism, we've got a dramatic increase of inequality. We have clear anger globally about the decimation of social welfare states, about the collapse of ways of life because of the extremeness of the kind of capitalist of the capitalism that we've had for the last 40 years. So the liberals or the liberal capitalists, they're not the left's allies. Since the defeat of the Soviet Union, it's been sort of like widespread liberalism without a strong voice championing it. And so what has it done? It's moved towards the right. So part of our analysis on the left has got to be, we can't just worry about the fact that during the times of opposition to leaders that were installed by the United States and by the kind of global imperialism, that at those times we were out. I'm thinking of like the war about the Iranian Revolution. That's what's in my head. Like that the left was allied with the the Islamists doesn't mean the left was wrong. That doesn't mean they were wrong. They were trying to build a coalition to bring down the Shah. That was the right thing to do. That it went badly doesn't mean that the left is forever a failure, right? It just means that the left has to get strong again and build again with working people, because for the most part, it's liberals who don't want the working people brought into politics. And if we don't do it, then they get brought in by more conservative, more traditionalist, more religious sectors. But I think that we can't get locked into mistakes from the past, but recognize, why was it the case that they were made? It was made in the case out of opposition to a particular kind of regime, a particular kind of rulership. That, I don't know if that answers the question very well, but that's, yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Dean, for joining me today and sharing your insights. I really appreciate your time and perspective, and I'm grateful to have had you on the show.
All right, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.